When you ask someone to tell you their story, they often begin in the same way. First, they'll say,
My name is Claudia Folska.
My name is Ed Roberge.
My name is Jim Phipps.
My name is Randy Pierce.
Nelia, Cornelia Sargent is my name.
And then, more often than not, they'll tell you where they're from.
I was born in Seattle, Washington.
I'm the city engineer here in Concord, New Hampshire.
I live here in Burlington, Vermont.
I grew up between Claremont, New Hampshire, where we sit today, and Brookline, Massachusetts.
That sense of place, of where we come from, where we live, is an integral part of our personal narrative. And why shouldn't it be? After all, the places we live and work in, and the spaces we navigate through, have a profound impact on our day-to-day lives. In this day and age, getting where you need to go is easier than ever. Once upon a time, a person's world would probably have consisted of the tiny town they lived in, and maybe the towns or cities nearby. A trip that might just take a few hours today could have taken months, or even years. For example, it took Lewis and Clark 1 year, 6 months, and a day to get from St. Louis to the Pacific Ocean. Today, you could do that same trip in about 32 hours of driving, or about 4. If you wanted to fly. The navigation most of us do these days is curated. We're not out in the wilderness finding our way with a compass and using the stars as our guide. We're driving on roads, we're walking on sidewalks, we're using man-made signs and signals to find our way. Even if you aren't traveling far. For instance, if you're going somewhere within the limits of the city or town that you live in, you're still surrounded by markers that tell you where you are and where to go. For example, take a right at the end of the road and go straight for a bit. Cross to the other side of the street and climb the steps to the subway platform. Get on the Manhattan-bound platform and take the J train into the city. Once you're over the bridge, get off at Canal Street and switch to the 6. Then ride it a couple of stops before remembering that the 6 doesn't run to the subway stop you need. Get out and wait for the 4 or the 5, then ride those to the last stop in Manhattan. Once you're out of the platform, follow the signs for the park, and then you've arrived at your destination. Seems straightforward enough, right? Now let's complicate it a bit. Can you do that same trip with your eyes closed? Would you know when it was okay to cross? Would you know where to cross to get to the station? Once in the station, how would you know which train you were getting on, or which train you were going to take? How would you know where to get off, or which direction you should go once you were back up on the street? What would be left to guide you? Navigating without sight seems like it would be impossible, but lots of people do it every day.
I'm totally blind, have been since 2000, so about 14 years now.
I've been visually impaired starting when I was about 20 or 21.
I was fully sighted until the age of 17 when I was diagnosed with retinitis pigmentosa, which is comparable to the freckles that we find on our noses on the back of our eyeballs.
At about 4th or 5th grade, they realized, hey, this kid isn't reading quite right. There's something wrong. He's verbal. Well, he's got a reading problem. Maybe he's just faking, not seeing stuff. And of course, much to their surprise, they found I had this disease called Stargardt's.
Roughly 285 million people worldwide have some form of vision loss, and 39 million of those people are blind. Of the 119 million Americans over the age of 40, 3.4 million are visually impaired. That's more than the population of Chicago. Blindness can affect anyone, at any time. You might be born blind, or it might occur suddenly as the result of an injury or accident. Or you could develop a disease that affects you slowly, decreasing your vision over time. In fact, the onset might be so slow that it could take years to recognize that it's happening at all. Most people think of blindness as something binary. Either you have your sight or you don't. But really, blindness is more of a spectrum. The standard for perfect vision is known as 20/20 vision. What that means is that when you look at an object that's 20 feet away, it appears to be about 20 feet away. Now, the World Health Organization has defined blindness as having visual acuity less than 2500, meaning that the object which is still only 20 feet away appears as clearly as if it were 500 feet away.
What macular degeneration means is you've lost your acuity, which is, based, that's a part of seeing that's based on seeing small objects, being able to read, to see signs, okay? You've got peripheral vision, but you don't have central vision, so your acuity is not as great. If I'm looking at you, do I see detail? No. Do I see you? Yes. What's it look like to me? And my best description is it's like looking at pointillism. The closer you get to pointillism, the less you see, and the further away you get, the more you see. Well, it's the reverse. One of my friends has said, well, it's sort of like swimming underwater. It's sort of vague out there.
The WHO also defined blindness as having a visual field of less than 10 degrees. In that case, a person could have 20/20 central vision, but they might not be able to see something that's right next to them. This is commonly referred to as tunnel vision. That total lack of sight that most people think of, that's only about 15% of the blind population. Everyone else has some amount of residual light perception. Any amount of vision loss isn't going to be easy. Humans are very visual creatures. Our brain devotes nearly 30% of its processing power to vision. Compare that to touch, which gets 8%, or hearing, which gets only 3%. Take away our sense of sight, and you've removed our primary method of engaging with the world. This is Phil Hammerslaw in Burlington, Vermont. Phil is an advocate for increasing accessibility for bicycles on the road. He also worked in job placement for the blind for many years.
Job development meant not just finding a person a job, but getting them into a headset where they could think positively about their disability. I mean, one of the first questions that clients would ask me is, how do I get there? Not, how do I prepare myself for the job? How do I get there? Paradigm shift with them and say, look, we'll get you there. Let's first concentrate on getting you ready to present yourself for the job. Do you have the skills for the job? The transportation becomes secondary, but not to them. It's really hard to swallow because you're so used to the struggle of having to get somewhere.
The reason for all those fears and worries is simple. The world we live in just isn't designed for blind people. But what if it were? What if getting around didn't have to be a nightmare? What if we made spaces that actually helped blind people find their way? What would that look like? Let's start with the basics. What strategies do blind people have for getting around?
You're always building on success.
This is Ed Christopher. He's a mobility and orientation specialist at the Carroll Center for the Blind in Newton, Massachusetts.
The Carroll Center is a center for adventitiously blinded adults. We also have work programs where we help youngsters get their first job, and we work with them and job coaches, and we teach them how to get to and from their job. And as a mobility instructor, that's what I've been heavily involved in, teaching people how to travel safely, how to travel comfortably. Each program is custom made to the individual and their particular needs and their abilities. Probably start with indoor protective techniques. We call it arm and hand and forearm techniques, just a hand across the body, touching the shoulder out about 120 degrees as they move around. And then we would go outside and start them with cane travel.
The cane is the main method that people use to help them navigate. It's light, it's cheap, and it helps increase the amount of information that the blind person has access to about the world around them.
I found it very frustrating having so much less information about my environment. I don't know whether I'm walking past a tree, a telephone pole, or a lamppost. One flick of a cane, just glancing it for just a second, and I know immediately whether that's a tree, a telephone pole, or a lamppost.
A cane is an object detector, which means as you use it, it's going to find out what's in front of you. And as you encounter each object, you can identify as needed and work around otherwise.
We would work in quiet areas, learn them the basic techniques, the arc, hand positioning, rhythm of walking. The cane moves in an arc in front of the person. The visually impaired person would hold the cane in front of them about belt high and would pivot the cane in an arc the width of their shoulders. There's also what we call being in step with the cane, which means if you were stepping on the left, the cane tip would be on the right. So as you moved, it would be like a windshield wiper effect. And that would allow the person to detect an obstacle 2.5 feet before they arrive there, and to give them time to stop.
I don't leave the house without either my walking stick or a cane. I love my technology. I use it every single day. But batteries fail, technology fails. The cane will find that cliff before you come to it, or as I found out, it will find the wall before your nose finds it. There's nothing takes the place of a cane or a guiding eyes, a guide dog, a good mobility aid.
Now, it's not entirely certain when we first domesticated dogs, but current scientific analysis puts it at about 19,000 to 40,000 years. So dogs have been by our sides as companions for a very, very long time. Blind people have been working with dogs since at least the time of the Roman Empire, and probably earlier.
My name is Randy Pierce. I'm a 48-year-old blind man in Nashua, New Hampshire, and I am totally blind, as I have been for the last 14 years, so I was fully sighted most of my life. My first choice in travel and how to manage travel as a blind person is the mobility that a guide dog gives me. If I'm walking to my bus stop, it's about 3/10 of a mile. It takes me about 15 minutes because I'm staying on the side of the road, tapping the side of the road as I go. If it's trash day, it takes me about a half hour because I'm now going around every garbage can set out on the street. If it's trash and recycle day, I might as well stay home, right? Because that same journey just got that much longer. Now, a guide dog is about object or obstacle avoidance. They naturally can see them, and they'll weave you out and around it without any delay on your part, and they're naturally trained to handle that. I find that with my guide dog, that 15-minute trip in the best of circumstances becomes a 5-minute trip.
I have now been legally blind and functionally blind for 39 years. I used a cane for the first 6 years exclusively, and then I chose to start working with a guide dog. And I worked almost continuously with guide dogs up until about 2 years ago. And I'm back to working with canes. Obviously, there's a big difference between navigating with a dog and a cane, and there are advantages to each.
I'm 6'4". My cane will never tell me the height obstacles that I can hit. My guide dog will. And lastly, and perhaps most powerfully, is the social interaction. People are often uncomfortable with things that they're not familiar with. If something's a little different, they can be a little thrown off their normal response. And blindness is absolutely one of those. And the dog often represents an icebreaker. They'll make a comment, that's a handsome dog you have, or how long have you been working with that dog? It's almost like when people ask, how about that weather today? What are they doing? They're making a tentative outreach to another human and trying to find their comforts without any personal attachment, whereas they don't really want to say, even though they may be thinking it, I see that you're blind. But that may be what's on their mind, and they're trying to figure out how to broach a subject, and that dog icebreaker is powerful.
I love the privilege of working with a four-legged companion, and I did used to train horses in another lifetime, long time ago as a teenager. I love working with animals. I enjoy the companionship, and I really just delight in that partnership, the teamwork. It is teamwork.
What's the relationship between a person and their best friend? It's different in every pairing, and that's certainly going to be true for guide dogs as well. I can tell you my relation is that, let's start with time. We're going to spend 24/7 together every day of our lives that we're working together, and that's a lot of time. My last guide dog and I have spent more time together than I did with either of my parents growing up. Put that into perspective. That's a lot of time you spend. Then you add the interdependence. As much as they do for me, I'm also responsible for them as well. So you really build that in as a strong foundation. Now, the kind of coup de grace of this is, in my case, there are invariably times where my guide dog is going to make a decision that's going to impact my safety. And it's almost always to the positive, right? Getting me out of the way of a hybrid car that's not making noise but pulled out without looking as they went to turn. They can see it and react before my ears could ever pick up the sound of it because it's not a combustion engine. So each of my guide dogs, and I'm on my third, have at some moment done something that saved me from injury. How do you not intensify the bond when that occurs? And the whole premise of the guide dog and handler relationship is to build that bond, to make them want to work for you for the same reasons. With that as the premise, it's not surprising that I think in most cases you'll find it's the closest relationship any handler will ever have is going to be with their dog guide. Presently, I am president of an organization. It's a charity called 2020 Vision Quest. The reason I founded this is I love the opportunity to educate and to motivate, maybe inspire a little, but I also want to accomplish some things as well. And I got to take the first steps when I didn't think it was going to be possible. And I want to make sure, my goal is to make sure no one is ever going to be in the same situation as me without the help that I received. That's really the sum total of what inspired this project. And my love for some pretty fun adventures helped us use those experiences to raise awareness and attention for everything we're doing.
Randy's not kidding about his love for adventures. His last guide dog was named the Mighty Quinn, and he certainly lived up to his name.
The first principle of 2020 Vision Quest, our first quest, was that I was going to take 10 leisurely years to climb all 48 of the 4,000-foot peaks here in the state of New Hampshire. And that would finish, of course, in the year 2020. So that was our original goal, and we sort of overachieved. 37 months into that, we completed the goal for the second time, because in the middle of this, I climbed all 48 in one single winter season to really emphasize that whole notion of ability awareness. It's something that 46 humans and 2 dogs had ever done prior to our doing it, and I like the notion that the Mighty Quinn and I were able to take our ability awareness to kind of new levels. Hard for anyone.
Quinn unfortunately passed away in January 2014. To honor his memory, Randy began a program called Miles for Quinn, in which he and other members of the 2020 Vision Quest community could log the miles they traveled while exercising in Quinn's honor. But Randy's adventures are far from over. He's begun working with a new guide dog named Autumn and wasted no time in getting back out on the trails.
Life is about risk management. People say all the time, is it safe for you to hike? There is no guarantee of safety in anything we do. Most dangerous thing most of us are going to do any day is get in a car. That's, statistically, that's the reality. What you do is you try to mitigate your risks, minimize the risk factors. If you don't know the trail you're hiking and you don't know the climate you're going into, you're not going to be as properly prepared. If you don't have the practice with working with your cane or your guide dog on that, or with the fellow hikers who might be guiding you, you can lead yourself into trouble. So what I'm saying there is there's a common theme. The more you can learn and educate yourself about any part of the experience you're undertaking, the easier it will be.
I like when you do that work, girl. That is not conventional guide dog work.
There's a commonly held belief that when you lose one sense, the other sense is increased to make up for it. The reality is that you actually have to train yourself to pay attention to those senses, as well as make the connections in order to make sense of what those senses are telling you.
I was exceptionally lucky to work with a man who pioneered the field of sensory retraining. His name was Robert Amendola.
This is Nelia Sargent. Nelia has worked as a peace advocate for the majority of her life, playing a key part in the bicentennial March for Nuclear Disarmament when she was just 21 years old.
Robert Amendola claimed that 2,000 blind people had taught him everything he knew about blindness. He was fully sighted. He was actually a visual sculptor. He'd won the Rome Prize at Yale in sculpture, so I gather he was a very good sculptor. He developed a technique of teaching how 6 of the 7 visual functions are replaceable with our own innate perceptual resources. You can rather arbitrarily divide the functions of vision into 7 different areas: light, field, motion, form, depth, imagery, and color. 6 of the 7 are replaceable. Can you guess which one is not replaceable? It's color. When we forget color, it is gone. And so I quite deliberately keep a very vivid palette very much alive. Hue, value, and chroma mean a great deal to me. And some of my friends tease me that I'm one of the fussiest people they know about colors, and I love hearing the subtleties of undertones described, because blue isn't just blue. There's periwinkle and cobalt and sky blue and powder blue, and I mean, there's just so many different blues.
Father Thomas Carroll contacted Amendola and asked him to help train blind veterans whose difficulty forming images of the space around them was impeding their movement through it. Amendola would go on to use what he learned from the veterans to create lesson plans for what he called videation, or how to improve spatial awareness and train your other senses to make up for lost vision.
He talked about many different kinds of hearing. There's direct sound, there's reflected sound, there's sound shadows. I remember his parking. Now, I knew the make and the model of his vehicle. I was quite familiar with his car because we often traveled to different locations. And I remember his parking on Memorial Drive in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And there's a very broad expanse of wide open, flat, mowed lawn between Memorial Drive and the river. And I remember his parking his car on the edge of Memorial Drive with no other parked vehicles right close by. We walked about 100 feet away. He spun me around and then he said, "Now go find the car." The object of this was to use the sound shadow, the sound of continuously passing cars on the other side of his parked vehicle, parked all by itself. And because I knew the make and the model of the car, the object of this exercise was that the very first point I touched would be the car handle. It was actually quite easy. I could hear where the car's sound shadows started and where they ended, and because I knew the car, it was easy for me to judge, and therefore it was quite easy to walk up and gracefully open the car door without bumbling from one end to the other as a blind person.
His work is not well known, but the Carroll Center still teaches some aspects of videation today. Nelia hopes to give Amendola's work some visibility and make it easily accessible to everyone.
Every child has these skills, and we all use these skills as children. To varying extent, as our vision takes over, we lose these skills. But you will notice amongst any group of your friends that some of you are more comfortable and less clumsy at night in an unfamiliar place than others of you. Those of you who manage more gracefully have retained some of these skills that we lost as our vision takes over. These are the skills, these are the tools to grace and independence. And although most of us who had his training are considered superhuman, extraordinary blind, I believe every blind person should be given access to these tools.
There are many different ways someone might improve their spatial awareness. You might use small thought exercises like imagining a vertical line through a building whenever you encounter a fountain or a bathroom, knowing that it will most likely run all the way up. Or you might work to improve your knowledge of the space ahead of time, using navigation aids like a tactile map.
One of the things I love about these maps, these are called raised relief maps, and the semantics is important, as I called many a map store trying to find them until I used the right semantics, is that I can feel my way through this mountain. It is a topographical map that actually has the 3D texture. So for example, I'm starting in this southwest corner, which is Mount Moosilauke, and I use that as reference because it lets me follow the contours of the land. That's the beauty of this map. You know, we sort of build roads along those contours, so pretty quickly what I'm discovering is that I'm going right into Franconia Notch here, which means this is Cannon Mountain, former home of the old men of the mountain. And if I come up this side of the notch, I've got, Flume, Liberty, Lincoln, and Lafayette, which is one of the most beautiful ridge walks in all of the White Mountains. You're just above tree line for a nice long stretch up there, a couple of miles. And you get to come over here to a nice pinnacle at Garfield. We're kind of surrounding the Pemigewasset Wilderness, the biggest wilderness in New Hampshire. But, you're going to give a map tour almost invariably what people want to see. They want to come over here to the big guy, right? The tallest peak, which I know right away by feel, has to be George. And let me give it a quick check, and yes, it is. Mm-hmm. So, right here is where the Lake of the Clouds hut is. Beautiful place to watch a sunset. Come across Washington over here to Jefferson, and then down the Edmonds Cole and up to Adams, which is actually my favorite of the remote peaks because it's actually more hiking than you do and more remote since there's no auto road or cog railway up to the top of it. But and here's Madison. So this would be a Northern Prezi Traverse, which I got to do once. It was pretty marvelous in the winter, but you're just above tree line for 8 miles of hiking along here. 8 miles all above tree line with just all these views unfurling. And for the non-visual, I use my fingers to understand the angle and the profile of all these mountains that are off in our view. And if I take enough time, I can learn all that detail as I go. So that's why I love these raised relief maps. Vision is all about your brain putting the images together, imagination if you prefer, but it's all neurology. And while sight lets you see everything that's around you now, whether it's tactilely or actual vision, vision is like super sight. It lets you use any of your inputs beyond your eyes to see what's around you and everything it can become. So I really love the notion that you can have an incredible vision even if you have no sight.
Tactile maps are an incredibly useful tool for the blind, not only to help them plan which route they're going to take, but to give them a broader understanding of the space, giving them greater ability to adapt when their route is compromised.
When I could see, I loved maps as a kid. I would study maps. I always liked to know where I was, how far things were away. I can't do that anymore. I can't see the maps.
This is Tom Frank in Burlington, Vermont. Tom is a self-professed technophile and, in addition to a cane, relies heavily on his cell phone to get around.
My name's Tom Frank. I'm 65 years old, and I've been visually impaired starting when I was about 20 or 21. I was in the Army, and my vision started to go bad for no known reason, just a bad optic nerve. So I was in the Army, and after a little while they discharged me. From there I went to college. I didn't have much technology other than regular tape recorders, those sorts of things that we all know about, but GPS has come of its own in the last 10 years. When I met my wife about 10 years ago, let's see, we've been married almost 8 years now, for a wedding present, she bought me a GPS system, and she bought it for me at the time. The little PDA that it was on, along with the application, the GPS receiver, the whole thing was $2,000. And it did one thing, it helped you get around. It was fairly slow, but it did work. She was the one that when the iPhone, well, simply when the cell phone came out, I sort of resisted it for a while, and she's the one that insisted I get the cell phone. That's helped me a lot. And then when the miracle phone came out, my little iPhone here, it's really everything I need. The GPS is built in. The nice thing about this phone is that the speech is built into it. It probably can't hear it, but it's talking to me. I have my calendar, all of those sorts of applications on them.
What we're finding now is that a lot of people who are blind or have low vision are actually using personal devices because they can get vibrations, vibration warnings from them.
This is Ruth Super, a wayfinding expert for the Institute for Human-Centered Design in Boston.
They can get audio, they can listen to information such as audio directions, and a lot of wayfinding for the blind and low vision is centered around personal devices.
I have 255 applications on my phone. I'm one of those obnoxious people. Then when people ask me a question, I say, there's an app for that, and I haven't. One really interesting application that I use now, it's called Ariadne GPS. It's actually an Italian application, and the nice thing about the iPhone or phone that uses the Android system, there are people around the world that make these applications. My wife and I were on vacation a couple of weeks ago in Savannah, Georgia. And actually, before we had flown into Chicago Airport, and I know it's 700 and
Chicago Airport, 757.21 miles at 6 o'clock compass.
the way I was at 6 o'clock, it's that way. So it not only helps me know where I am here, but it helps me find where I've been and all the places I want to go. The thing is, when you're visually impaired, it's a somewhat of an isolating disability. Once you get there, you can talk to people, you can engage, but it's a real transportation. I can't get there from here. And while I'm going, I don't know where I am, I don't know what's around. So with applications like Blind Square, I have a Navigon, another application. Most people are familiar too. There's Navigon, TomTom, they all have one. It'll tell me points of interest, where I am, street crossings. My wife, I loved maps. I love to know where I am. I love to know which direction I was going, all of that. She doesn't. So I'm the navigator when we go place. It gives me a sense of control over what's happening. I'm not just a totally passive passenger.
In 1960, a professor at MIT named Kevin Lynch concluded a 5-year study and published the findings in a book called The Image of the City. In it, he examines the way that people mentally map their city and what makes a place coherent and cohesive to its inhabitants. Lynch found that people created mental images of their cities using very similar components. He named these components paths, which are the routes we travel on, nodes, which are major intersection points that force us to make a decision, edges, which are boundaries we use to distinguish between one area and another, districts, which are bigger areas that contain all other elements and evoke a strong central theme, and landmarks. Landmarks are points in the environment around us that help us understand exactly where we are. Think of a distinctive building like the Capitol Building in Boston or the Empire State Building in New York, or really any other big building you can think of. If you have a general understanding of where you are, you can use that building to orient yourself. The more familiar you are with a space, though, the less likely you are to use a distant landmark. Instead, you'll find smaller, personalized landmarks like that one awesome mural or that weird green statue that everyone hits their head on. Landmarks help us to contextualize our spaces, to create a more concrete image of the places we live in. The more landmarks available to us, the more readily we can understand the environment around us. Kevin Lynch referred to this as the imageability of a city. But how do you create an image of a city when you can't see? One of the major issues for people who are blind is a lack of information that is legible to them. For quite some time, this issue led experts to believe that the blind were incapable of creating mental maps at all. But this isn't the case.
And what I'd like you to do is to draw a sketch map of when you get off the light rail on your way here to the CCB to where you're sitting right now. And as you draw, if you could talk aloud, as much as possible, giving me all the detail that you can recall on your route.
Okay.
So, starting at the top right of my map, because I think that will give me the best space. First, I'm going to put cardinal directions on my map. Okay, I'm going to put a north and north, and this is south. That's all I'll do. Okay.
So that would be north.
I get off at downtown Littleton.
So we're getting off the train.
When we get off the light rail, we get off the west side exit.
Then I'm gonna go across a set of tracks.
I make a slight left.
We'll be at a set of stairs.
When I get to the other side of the tracks, I need to usually angle off a little bit as I head toward a set of stairs.
Well, when I would come up the stairs, I would smell coffee because there's a cafe called The Bean, which is right at the light rail station.
I'm gonna try to get a wall in here.
I hear a stream somewhat off to my left, somewhat straight ahead.
And then I would hit what they call the bridge.
And there's a little drainage thing, water cascading.
Go across that bridge, and you'll come to the bus depot.
I pass 3 bus shelters. The bus stop has 3 indentations, and then there's a pole up here that we call the DNA pole. Everybody runs into that DNA pole or loses the skin or something.
They call it a DNA pole because a lot of people run into it, but they're not using their cane right.
Oh, so you leave some DNA on the pole?
Yeah.
Follow the sidewalk there. Watch out for this. This, you don't want to go there. There is about a foot drop off the edge of the sidewalk right at the corner. It's also a good landmark because when you're coming the other direction, coming off here, there's kind of a dirt path that runs off here toward the street.
You go up a small hill. On the left-hand side is a grated fence.
Keep following the fence.
Here is our final destination, an X.
This is Claudia Folska. Claudia is an elected official at the Denver, Colorado Regional Transportation District and the holder of a dual PhD in architectural planning and cognitive science.
Probably you're all familiar with Kevin Lynch, MIT, 1960, The Image of a City. So I thought, well, I'm going to find out what these blind people are thinking about their places and spaces and ask them to draw a sketch map. So I used the same Lynchian methodology. What I noticed on these maps, we could actually see that it was segmented. So it's A to B, B to C, very linear. Again, the manifestation of landmarks was really embedded in the environment, counting things like DNA poles, ankle biters, burning bushes. That's how they learn to live in an ever-changing environment.
What Claudia discovered is that the mental maps that blind people make are almost identical to those made by people with sight. They have paths, nodes, edges, and even districts. But the key difference was in the nature of the landmarks. Obviously, they couldn't use any visual information. So instead, their landmarks were made up of sounds, smells, and subtle tactile changes.
We pay attention to all sorts of landmarks that people wouldn't expect. You know, the easy ones, my nose is telling me, oh, that's a coffee shop, I must be coming up on the Dunkin' Donuts, right? Or smells like new wood, that's the hardware store, or the hair salon. I mean, all of those smells you learn to identify, not only with what they are, but with where they are. Anyone has to take the time to properly learn their environment to manage it. And that's true whether you've got vision or not. You know, there's a lot of people who move into an urban environment and quickly get lost until they learn what the outlay of the streets are. But as a non-sighted person, I want more streets because that's just more landmarks for me to know.
We did hear from a number of folks, and one particular person came to us and said, here's the issue. You know, I'm walking from, say, the central, this upper area, say around City Hall, and I'm walking down to the downtown. And I'm crossing 3 traffic signals. And each traffic signal is a little bit different.
This is Ed Roberge. He's the city engineer for Concord, New Hampshire.
We talk about Main Street in a couple of areas. One is safety, obviously. One is a state of good repair. And we really haven't invested much of dollar-wise in Main Street since probably the late 70s, early 80s. So the state of good repair has gone to kind of to the wayside. And we have a lot of accessibility issues.
The urban environment, I would think, is probably where the majority of blind people spend much of their travel time, I would guess. And it has its own unique challenges.
There's a lot of interesting challenges you're going to encounter, and I find that the urban environment is going to hold a little more of them because it's where we've manipulated our environment the most, so it becomes less predictable. Along sidewalks, a more environmental challenge are the notion of height obstacles. I love that many city streets can have trees growing on the sidewalk to kind of give you some shade, but I think about the height of the person walking under them. You know, it's going to vary. I'm, 6'4". A lot of those branches are in my range. And if it's a rainy day, I can expect they're going to be 2 inches lower because of the weight of the rainwater pulling them down. So just how high cities trim those things. I think the most common challenge is that we want to cross streets on a regular basis. You're going to have a lot of those in that. And I mean, obviously, at that intersection, there's a lot of key points. Is there anything to denote that there's a curb or the ramp to let a wheelchair down? Is there anything really to denote it and help us find where that edge is? Because the difference of being 1 foot into a road versus right on the edge of it can be the difference between some pretty serious damage. We've built this habit. We may have, accessible walk lights, we may not. But even just finding, where did you put the pole? It's not consistent to find the pole for the button to get to the walk light. And we have this habit of cluttering that area. Since there's already a pole there, why don't we put, you know, a giant pot there, and why don't we put a newspaper stand, although those are getting a little more rare. But we clutter things around there, and then we add winter, and we're going to just go ahead and pile up all the snow right there as well, making it, you know, effectively not worth trying to find it, because all of that delay and diversion is taking you off your orientation for which way is straight and where you're crossing.
In the rural parts of the state, there's basically no infrastructure, no sidewalks.
This is Jim Phipps of the IRIS Network in Maine. The IRIS Network is an organization that works to rehabilitate the newly blind and is also an advocacy group for urban planning.
There may or may not be crosswalks painted, and you need to identify the right place to cross the street to travel safely and so on. Turnings and so on are more difficult often to identify if there's no curbing, and often the pavement will blend. You'll have a gas station on a corner or something, and the pavement is all basically flat.
One consistent difficulty in both urban and suburban travel is the lack of defined curbing. Wheelchair access, I totally understand and respect, and yet when there is no slope easily detectable, whether it be summertime or even worse in the snow, with snow and ice up here in New England, I cannot know when I'm stepping off the sidewalk into the street unless there's traffic in the road. Well, let's see, close to 40 years ago, that was almost, that was just, my impression is that was barely in existence 40 years ago. Thus, I had much better curb definition and distinction 40 years ago. And I believe that the wheelchair access and blind access can very well and easily coexist, but it needs better design work. A completely flat, no distinguishing barrier may be the best for wheelchairs, but I believe that there is a way for wheelchairs to coexist with something that will work for the blind to distinguish that edge. So I know when I'm stepping out into a street off the curb.
The corners are important because they give us directionality and orientation and how to cross without veering outside of the sidewalk. So now with no corners, I call them virtual corners, it's a problem. A friend of mine lives in the gas lamp district in San Diego. She called me the other day and she said, oh my gosh, this taxi plowed through 36 people coming out of a nightclub at night. And I said, oh, there's no corner, that's why. Now, if the taxi driver who fell asleep at the wheel had that corner, it would have jolted him, right? And maybe he would not have, plowed through 36 people. Leonardo da Vinci invented the sidewalk, right, to separate pedestrians from traffic. And so the new urbanist shared streets and spaces, forget it. If a human being interacts with a car or a train, they lose every time.
One of the biggest differences that I notice coming from a rural context is the background level of noise. And especially the modern hybrid vehicles are so quiet that in an urban setting they become highly dangerous. And every blind person I know who's been struck by a car never heard the car coming. I'm lucky so far. I've never been hit. I have had a cane broken once, standing up on a curb with a car that sort of jumped up onto the curb. It broke my cane, actually. I was in the right place, the car was not. Hey, if you don't like the way I drive, get off the sidewalk, right?
What we've always seen as traffic engineers is, the built environment was always very auto-centric. And we've got some studies that are historically on my shelf right here from the 70s and 80s that said, you know what, Main Street should be a 5-lane highway, and that's how things were built back in the day.
So while I was writing my dissertation, I was very, very focused. And then I heard a press release came out and said, oh, RTD on the West Corridor, it's the light rail that's going to be opening, is going to have silent crossings. at grade. And I'm like, oh no, I got to get out of here and go do something about it, because that just can't be. Anyway, so I wrote a letter, sent it to the board of directors. Nobody, of course, got back to me. Then one person did, and he said, oh, you have to go down to the PUC. And I said, no, I'm writing my dissertation. I just wanted you to know, don't do that. Put the signals, do the ding ding. And anyway, so he wouldn't do it. I had to go down there. And a lot of blind people were there, maybe 80 of them, and they were talking, and all the engineers were saying, no, we don't need it. They're not talking and thinking about pedestrians, and certainly not blind ones. Oh yeah, all the safety measures are in place for cars.
For the last 60 years or so, we have focused totally on the automobile. It's like if you look at a stool, only one leg is on the stool. The other two legs are public transportation and what we call active transportation, which is walking and biking. If we think of it as a space rather than a, quote, road, think of the word thoroughfare, which used to be the word for roads. Thoroughfare meant open to everyone. It is not this isolated, economically driven, car thing.
Phil is also a very passionate cyclist and spent much of his youth working as a bike tour guide.
My first trip was with American Youth Hostel, which I took a group of New York kids to Vermont, and I fell in love with it. We bicycled the entire state of Vermont into Boston, Massachusetts, took the ferry across to Cape Cod, bicycled the entire Cape, and then took the ferry from Wellfleet out to Nantucket, bicycled Nantucket, and came home. The bike trips led to a realization that you can really bicycle anywhere. Obviously, there are going to be people who will always ride. They're the daring ones, okay? But 86% of the people who are polled, and asked, would you ride a bike? They'd say, sure, I'd ride a bike if the roads were safe. Well, the way to make roads safe is to create roads that are shared, not just, by cars, but shared with pedestrians and with cyclists. When you look at the economics of Department of Public Works to them, up until recently, at least here in Burlington, means fixing roads. Well, that's great, because, we're fixing roads. Why? Well, it's for cars. No! Roads need to be accessible to people. This is really important, and instead of focusing on the road for the car, it's focusing on how can we make a better sidewalk? How can we deal? Noise was another thing I was talking about, the incredible noise that cars make. A car goes by and you hear, 10 bicycles go by and you hear, what a difference, what a fabulous difference that is, just in the quality of life and sound, because soundscape is just as important as a visual scape. As a matter of fact, you're just not as aware of it as you are your visual. But for people with visual disabilities, it's everything.
So often our staff is consulted by city planners and traffic engineers on designing intersections and other projects so that they are safe and accessible to people who are blind. One recent controversy is the prevalence or the reemergence of the traffic circle or roundabout as a means of, as an alternative to the traditional traffic signals, and those methods of designing streets can pose challenges for people who are blind, because in some situations the traffic never stops, and that means that pedestrians have a harder time crossing the street whether they can see or not.
When we start looking at context-sensitive solutions, which really drives a lot of our decisions, build it to what the context of the environment is, and that's very, very important. And we see what we hear from folks these days is we want safe roads, but we want roads that support other uses, like pedestrians, like safe sidewalks, like very effective crosswalks so folks can cross safely. the biking communities. You know, we have a significantly growing biking community, and we're proud to be a bike-friendly, designated as a bike-friendly community here in Concord, a bronze level. We're working on improving that, but nonetheless, that's quite an accomplishment with our focus on bike facilities, and we want to incorporate that into our infrastructure. So there's been significant changes. What we used to be, you know, build it and they will come, widened highways, we see build a multimodal community, and that's when they really come, and that's essentially it's a driver to the economic vitality of these communities, and that's what's most important to us.
Our work is really focused on the role of design in social equity across the spectrum of ability and of age, believing that design is a key to social equity for everyone. Why design if it doesn't change the human condition?
This is Valerie Fletcher. She's been the executive director of the Institute for Human-Centered Design since 1998.
So one of the things that we feel very strongly about is that accessibility and barrier removal, sort of barrier-free and accessible, are big ideas, big 20th century ideas that are enormously important. And they are the baseline of thinking about the role of design in social equity and in equal opportunity for everybody. We are an organization that really is a deep content expert on both accessibility and universal design. And we feel very strongly that they should not be confused, that universal design, inclusive design, human-centered design, design for all are not synonyms for accessibility. Accessibility is a baseline, a floor, not a very high floor, but it's a very precious starting point. The relationship between accessibility and inclusive or universal or design for all, we use human-centered design. These are all synonyms for a big idea about designing for people across the spectrum of human ability. And it really was born of a couple of insights that you could only have had when the world was a little more accessible. One of those insights was that, gosh, this is good for everybody. Some of us are old enough to remember when suitcases didn't have wheels. They didn't have wheels because we didn't have curb cuts. We can't imagine people carrying suitcases now. Everyone wheels a suitcase. That was really a byproduct of a world that had curb cuts. The kind of simple realization that, gosh, this is great for everybody. It improved life for people who push strollers all day, or baby carriages, or bicycles. So there was that insight that those very basic physical accessibility things made a difference for everybody. The other thing that had changed after the passage of the accessibility requirements was that we came to appreciate that people with disabilities were not people in a fixed condition. They didn't have a limitation that was the same every day or over the course of time, and that a diagnosis did not determine outcome. That we were privileged to know loads of people who had really significant issues. They might be people with quadriplegia, broken their back high. They couldn't walk, they couldn't use their hands, they might have a tracheotomy, and yet did extraordinary things. We witnessed people who were blind who were getting PhDs and creating extraordinary careers and doing research. We witnessed all kinds of people who once upon a time were considered people who needed to be cared for as people who could do whatever they wanted to do.
So my research had to do with how blind people navigate the built environment in the absence, or well, without sight. And then I took the findings of that research and I put it into the expansion of the largest investment in public transportation in American history, which is happening in the Front Range of Colorado. It's about $7.5 billion of a multimodal transportation system. And so that's why I wrote this book called Pedestrian-Oriented Developments, because really we're people building, designing, and creating policy for people. That's who we're building for, right? So anyway, then I went out and worked with the neighbors, and I really spent a lot of time on this. And the neighbors got involved. So I think one of the things that I think is a trend here is that you can't just have people come to you. You need to go to them, ask them questions, and get them engaged. And so together, the neighborhood representatives, the engineers at RTD, and we developed what we consider the gold standard in how to have at-grade crossings right through bedroom communities where neighbors are not really troubled. And what we did is we set it at 45 decibels, and then depending on the ambient noise, it can go up to 90 decibels, so it fluctuates during the day. And everyone was real happy with that. And they got to pick out the ding-ding. So they owned that.
The community has evolved over time, over the last 10 years, 20 years, to what I would say new heights of looking at balancing all needs in every aspect. One of the things it's the simplest thing is making sure that there's a clear, open path. That's a predictable path, and not sidewalks that are moving all over the place. That's really the biggest thing. There's an expectation of how we get from one space to another, and then there's consistency with drivers knowing how to react to folks that might be either vision impaired or mobility challenged. And that's what we tried to do. We tried to identify those deficiencies, be it whether or not it's access ramps on sidewalks, or it's push buttons, pedestrian signals on our traffic signals. We tried to really focus on that and make the environment as consistent as possible. And it's not a lot of work. It's really just focusing on, here's good design guidelines, and then let's apply it so it's consistent.
I love being a guy who can come out and just savor what this wilderness and this mountain has to offer. The trails are certainly pretty challenging when you can't see them, but it's part of that challenge that I'm looking for. And that's great when you choose to get out into a mountain. But it's not something I should have to deal with when I'm walking in the streets of my hometown. You sort of want some consistency, things you can expect to be able to navigate safely around your home.
This isn't about me. This is about the human condition, that all of us can experience some level of limitation, and that design plays a central role in how we experience that.
People with disabilities, until recently, have not really been considered a class on par with race, gender, ethnicity, religion, and it really is. And quite frankly, it's the largest majority. It is the majority minority right now. And it happens to be one that anyone can join at any time without notice.
The number one catalyst for this movement is actually the aging of the world's population, an undeniable phenomenon of the 21st century. We live on average 30 years longer than we did 100 years ago, a bonus of 30 years. But it doesn't come without some need to change the world we live in order for us to thrive all of our lives and have a quality of life. We are fortunate to share global policy that was created by the World Health Organization in 2002. They spent 10 years reaching a new consensus about the definition of disability, knowing that old ways of thinking about disability were terribly outmoded, and we really needed to hit a new place that was more appropriate for our time. They made a number of critical changes in how we think about disability. First of all, they looked at the data on aging and how much we survive both accident and illness and congenital condition at rates no one ever imagined possible. What is significant about the conversion of a functional limitation, which is now ordinary, to disability is the context of our lives. And the context of our lives is no longer just physical. In the 21st century, the context is physical, information design, communication design, policy, and attitude. So it's really a 5-part context. And they said we minimize disability when we minimize what is disabling about the context. In 2001, only 4 years after the first principles of universal design had been published, they said the most promising framework for figuring this out, for identifying facilitators that will minimize disability for people with functional limitations, short-term or long, that's the most promising framework. We now have to figure out how to do it. Among the big ideas that have been more and more resonant is this idea that we can constantly tinker with this and make it better and better. I think we're watching a revolution as we're seeing the prevalence of things like sight limitations. Blindness, congenital blindness is one thing, sight limitation is tied quite clearly to an aging population, as well as to children who once upon a time had sight-related congenital issues that didn't live very long, and now they are living often a typical lifespan. So we've got a very different story.
If you can make it accessible to the blind and visually impaired, then it's accessible to everybody, and that's what we call universal access.
I think that some of the built environment, that awareness that the sighted interests and the blind interests can overlap and be mutually beneficial in a win-win context, is a very exciting theme to look towards. And I appreciate that effort.
I think what I mean when I talk about the gold standard, the blind wayfinding is the gold standard for planners, transportation planners, is that when we can make everything legible and accessible to people who are blind, then we've sort of reached the basic human common denominator. And whether it's one person, 100 people, or 1 million people, everybody in our community should have a right to participate fully and reach their own full potential.
You talked to planners today about a vision for the future, and
as our population continues to age and our cities continue to grow, decisions about how we shape our public spaces will become increasingly important. Spaces that are not just accessible, but empower the lives of people on the fringe, also enrich the lives of everyone else who uses them. With that in mind, it's easy to see that making things better for people who are blind makes them better for everyone. We might not be there yet, but we're getting there.